I am Linda Howell, a 28-year-old paralegal living in the gray, rain-slicked suburbs of Seattle. For 28 years, I believed I was the difficult daughter, the one who had to work twice as hard to earn half the affection given to my golden boy younger brother Leo. I spent my life walking on eggshells that felt like shards of glass, trying to navigate the volatile moods of my mother, Evelyn. But nothing, not even 3 decades of her psychological warfare, could have prepared me for last Sunday. It was supposed to be a standard family dinner. The air in my parents' dining room smelled of rosemary, expensive red wine, and the suffocating tension that always precedes one of Evelyn's outbursts. I was sitting at the mahogany table, my hands folded in my lap, watching as my mother meticulously carved a roast chicken. She didn't look at me. She never really does. Her eyes were fixed on Leo, who was complaining for the 10th time about how his startup needed another $5,000 to cover operational costs. In reality, those costs were his bar tabs and a lease on a car he couldn't afford. "Linda, pass your brother the gravy," Evelyn snapped, her voice like a whip. "And stop looking so sour. You're lucky to be sitting at this table." I felt that familiar tightness in my chest. "I'm not looking sour, Mom. I'm just tired. I worked 60 hours this week at the firm." Evelyn dropped the carving knife, clattered against the fine china with a sound like a gunshot. She leaned forward, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated vitriol. Her skin looked papery and tight, her eyes bulging slightly. "Tired? You? You have no right to be tired in this house. You have no right to anything. I pay for my own apartment, Mom. I even paid for the wine we're drinking," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. That was the spark. Evelyn's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. She stood up so quickly her chair screeched against the hardwood floor. "You think you're a part of this? You think you belong here?" She laughed, a high-pitched, jagged sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. "We took you in out of pity, Linda. You were a mistake from a woman who didn't want you, and we were the saints who stepped in so you wouldn't rot in the system. You should be down on your knees every single day, grateful for every scrap of food you ever ate in this house. You aren't a Howell. You're a charity project that I'm tired of funding." The silence that followed was absolute. I looked at my father, Robert. He didn't look up from his plate. He just kept cutting his chicken, his movements mechanical, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth. He didn't deny it. He didn't defend me. Leo, meanwhile, had a smirk playing on the corners of his mouth, as if he'd finally been told the punchline to a joke he'd been in on for years. The room began to spin. The smell of the rosemary chicken became nauseating, a thick, greasy scent that clogged my throat. "Adopted?" I whispered. "Out of pity?" "Out of pure, exhausted pity," Evelyn hissed, leaning over the table until I could smell the acidic tang of the wine on her breath. "You were a burden then, and you're a burden now. Don't you ever forget where you came from, Linda. You came from nothing. Without us, you are nothing." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt a coldness settle into my marrow, a crystalline clarity that I had never experienced before. I stood up, grabbed my purse, and walked out the door. As I reached my car, I could hear her screaming through the open window that I was ungrateful and discarded. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and made a silent vow. If I was a charity project, then it was time for the donors to realize that their investment had just been liquidated. That night, I didn't go home to my apartment. I drove to a 24-hour pharmacy, my hands shaking so hard I could barely steer. I bought a DNA kit. I sat in the parking lot under the flickering fluorescent lights, spat into the tube, and sealed the envelope with a vengeance. While I waited for those results to process over the following weeks, the dam in my mind finally broke. All the memories I had suppressed, all the moments where I felt like an outsider in my own home, came rushing back in high definition. I remembered being 7 years old. It was Christmas morning. The living room was a sea of torn wrapping paper. Leo, who was 5, was surrounded by a mountain of Lego sets, a brand new bicycle, and a gaming console. I had one small box. Inside was a plain gray wool sweater and a pack of socks. When I looked at the pile of toys Leo had received and asked if Santa had forgotten the rest of my list, Evelyn hadn't hugged me or made an excuse. She had looked at me with cold, flat eyes and said, "Some children should just be happy they have a roof over their heads. Don't be greedy, Linda. It's unattractive." I remembered the incident when I was 12. I had won the regional spelling bee. I was so proud. I had studied for months, staying up late by the light of a desk lamp until my eyes burned. When I came home with the trophy, Robert had patted me on the head and said, "That's nice, honey." But when Leo came home an hour later with a participation ribbon from a soccer game he'd barely played in, Evelyn ordered a 3-course steak dinner and bought him a new pair of expensive cleats to celebrate his athleticism. I spent that night eating a leftover sandwich in my room, staring at my trophy and wondering what was wrong with me. Why wasn't my gold medal worth as much as his ribbon? The favoritism wasn't just about gifts, it was about the very air we breathed. Leo was allowed to fail. When he crashed my father's car at 16, it was an accident and a learning experience. When I got a B+ in AP chemistry, I was grounded for a month and told I was wasting the opportunities they had provided for me. The language of debt was always there, hidden in plain sight. They didn't call it adoption then, but they called it the cost of raising you. I remembered the exact sound of Evelyn's voice when she talked to her friends on the phone. I used to hide on the stairs and listen. "Linda is a challenge," she would sigh, her voice dripping with artificial martyrdom. "She's just so different from us. She has this dark streak. We do our best, of course. We provide everything. But sometimes you just can't change a person's nature." The time, I thought she meant I was just a moody teenager. Now I realize she was setting the stage. She was telling everyone that I was the other. The most painful memory, the one that kept me awake at 3 a.m. while I waited for the DNA results, was the time I got sick with a severe flu at 14. I was burning up, my fever hitting 103 degrees. I remember crawling to my mother's bedroom door, shivering and crying, asking for help. She didn't even get out of bed. She told me to go back to my room and stop being so dramatic, saying that she didn't have the energy to deal with my neediness. It was Robert who finally took me to the urgent care the next morning, but only after Evelyn complained that the car ride would make her late for her hair appointment. As I sat in my dark apartment staring at the tracking number for my DNA sample, I replayed that Sunday dinner argument over and over. Adopted out of pity. The words were a brand. But there was something in her eyes when she said it, a flicker of desperation. Evelyn was a woman who loved control more than she loved her children. She used guilt like a leash. If she could make me believe I was a charity case, she could ensure I never left, never succeeded too much, and always felt obligated to serve her. I thought about the Howell family tree. The prestigious lineage Robert always bragged about, the judges, the architects, the old money heritage. I had spent my life trying to live up to a legacy that, apparently, didn't even belong to me. Or did it? If I wasn't a Howell, then who was I? And if I was a Howell, then Evelyn was a liar of sociopathic proportions. The notification finally popped up on my phone at 4:14 a.m. "Your results are ready." My heart was drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. My palms were sweating as I swiped the screen. I scrolled past the ethnicity estimates, past the fun facts about my caffeine metabolism. I went straight to the DNA matches. I didn't just find a long-lost aunt or a distant cousin. I found a truth so explosive it made Evelyn's adoption lie look like a bedtime story. I looked at the top match, a 50% identical DNA hit. It wasn't some stranger. It wasn't a woman who didn't want me. I stared at the name on the screen, and for the first time in my life, I felt the power shift. I wasn't a charity project. I was a weapon. And I was about to blow the Howell family's carefully constructed world into 1,000 pieces. The name staring back at me on the screen wasn't a stranger's. It was Robert's. My father, the man who had sat silently at the table while his wife called me a charity project, was my biological father. The DNA match was a staggering 49.8%. But the kicker, the absolute nuclear bomb that leveled my reality, was the other match that popped up seconds later. A woman named Sarah Miller. 25% match. Paternal half-sister. I didn't have a Sarah Miller in my family tree. I had Leo. I checked Leo's name in the database because of course Evelyn had made him take a test years ago for a genealogy project. Leo wasn't a 50% match to me. He was a 0% match to Robert. I sat on my cold kitchen tile, the blue light of the phone illuminating the tears I didn't even know were falling. The irony was so thick I could taste it, metallic and sharp like blood. Evelyn had spent 2 decades treating me like an interloper, a stray dog she'd taken in to look like a saint, while all along I was the only one in that house who actually carried the prestigious Howell blood. And Leo? Her golden boy, the one who inherited the family looks and the family favor? He was the product of an affair. I began to piece it together with the cold, methodical logic of a paralegal. Evelyn must have cheated. When she got pregnant with Leo, she knew she had to keep the secret to maintain her lifestyle and Robert's fortune. But I was the living reminder of Robert's actual DNA. Perhaps I looked too much like a woman Robert had loved before her, or perhaps my very existence made her feel like a fraud. She had flipped the script. She had convinced Robert, and me, that I was the one who didn't belong so that no one would ever think to question Leo's place. I spent the next 3 days in a trance of high-definition investigation. I didn't go to work. I used my firm's access to public records to dig into my parents' marriage certificate and my own birth certificate. I found something tucked away in a digital archive of old hospital records. My birth was registered 2 months before my parents' official wedding date. Then I found the death certificate of a woman named Elena Vance. She died 28 years ago, 3 days after I was born, from postpartum complications. I looked up Elena Vance. She was beautiful, dark hair, high cheekbones, and a smile that looked exactly like the one I saw in the mirror every morning. She had been Robert's administrative assistant. The story wrote itself. Robert had an affair, Elena got pregnant, Elena died, and Evelyn, ever the strategist, agreed to adopt the bastard child on the condition that Robert never spoke of the mother again and that she could treat me however she wished. Then, she had her own child with someone else and passed him off as Robert's heir. Cruelty of it was breathtaking. She hadn't just bullied me, she had stolen my identity and my mother's memory. She had turned my father into a silent accomplice in my own psychological torture. I felt a roar of white-hot anger swell in my chest, a physical heat that made my skin itch. I wasn't just going to leave. I was going to dismantle her. I spent the rest of the week gathering ammunition. If I was going to strike, I had to be precise. I knew the Howell family finances better than they did. I had been the one helping Robert organize his estates and trust folders during my summer breaks from college because Leo was too busy partying. I remembered a specific file in Robert's home office, a heavy, fireproof safe behind a false book panel. He had given me the code years ago when he had a heart scare, telling me, "Just in case, Linda, you're the responsible one." Inside that safe was the family contingency folder. I waited until Thursday, knowing Evelyn would be at her weekly bridge club and Robert would be at his golf outing. Walking into that house felt like entering a tomb. The smell of Evelyn's expensive Santal candles made my stomach turn. I went straight to the office, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I punched in the code, my own birthday ironically, and the heavy door clicked open. I found it. A manila envelope labeled private. Inside was a notarized post-nuptial agreement I never knew existed. I scanned the legal jargon, my eyes darting across the lines. Clause 12.4. In the event of confirmed infidelity resulting in offspring not of the Howell bloodline, all claims to the Howell Trust, the primary residence, and the 401k holdings by Evelyn Howell shall be rendered null and void. My hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. Robert wasn't just a silent bystander. He was a coward who had protected his assets with a contract but hadn't protected his daughter with his heart. He had suspected. He must have known about Leo, or at least suspected, and kept this document as a sword of Damocles over Evelyn's head. And she, in turn, had spent 28 years crushing me to ensure Robert never looked too closely at the perfect son she'd given him. I heard the front door creak open. My breath hitched. "Linda? Is that you?" It was Leo. I could hear the jingle of his car keys, the keys to the Audi Robert had bought him for his 25th birthday. I shoved the documents into my bag and stepped out of the office just as he rounded the corner. He looked at me with that same lazy, entitled smirk. "What are you doing here, sis? Come to beg Mom for some more pity scraps?" I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the expensive watch Robert had gifted him for graduation, the designer polo shirt, the arrogance of a man who thought he owned the world by birthright. "No, Leo," I said, my voice steady and cold as a winter morning. "I just came to pick up a few things I left behind. Things that actually belong to me." "Whatever," he rolled his eyes, pushing past me to the kitchen. "Mom's still pissed at you, by the way. She says you're banned from the house until you write a formal apology for your outburst at dinner. She's thinking of cutting off your access to the family emergency fund, too." The emergency fund was a measly $3,000 Robert had set aside for me, which I hadn't touched in 5 years. Meanwhile, Leo had drained nearly $200,000 for his failed ventures. "She won't have to worry about that," I said, walking toward the door. "Tell her I'll be in touch. Very soon." As I drove away, I felt a strange, soaring sense of detachment. I wasn't the difficult daughter anymore. I wasn't the charity case. I was the beneficiary of a truth they had spent 3 decades trying to bury. I went straight to a high-end law firm, not the one I worked for, but their biggest rival. I handed over the DNA results, the copy of the postnup, and a list of every bank account I had access to. "I want to file a formal inquiry into the Howell Trust," I told the attorney, a sharp-eyed woman who looked like she ate sharks for breakfast. "And I want to serve my mother with a very specific set of papers." The attorney looked over the DNA results and the postnup, a slow grin spreading across her face. "Linda, this isn't just a family dispute. This is a total liquidation of her life." "Are you sure?" I thought about the gray wool sweater. I thought about the 103-degree fever. I thought about the rosemary chicken and the word pity. "I've never been sure of anything else in my life," I replied. "It's time to show my mother exactly what happens when you try to discard the only person who is actually keeping your secret safe." The weekend before I planned to serve the papers, I received a text from Evelyn. It wasn't an apology. It was a summons. "Leo is hosting an investor dinner at the house on Saturday. I expect you here at 4 p.m. to help with the catering staff and the floral arrangements. Since you aren't paying us back for your upbringing with money, you will pay with your time. Do not be late, Linda. Your father is already disappointed enough." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Even after her pity speech, she still expected me to show up as the unpaid help, the invisible hand that kept her social life polished. I realized then that she didn't just hate me, she relied on my presence to validate her own superiority. If I wasn't there to be the failure, how could she be the saint? I showed up. But I didn't show up to arrange lilies. I arrived at 4:30 p.m., deliberately late, wearing a tailored emerald green silk dress that cost more than my monthly rent, a gift to myself from my savings. The house was already buzzing with the elite of Seattle's tech and real estate scene. Crystal glasses clinked, and the smell of expensive hors d'oeuvres filled the air. Evelyn spotted me from across the foyer. She looked stunning in a deep navy gown, but her eyes turned into icy slits the moment they landed on me. She marched over, her heels clicking like a countdown timer on the marble floor. "What are you wearing?" she hissed, grabbing my arm with a grip so tight her manicured nails dug into my skin. "You were supposed to be in the kitchen. Go change into the black slacks I left in the laundry room. Now." "I'm not here to work, Evelyn," I said, loud enough for a nearby couple to glance over. I didn't call her Mom. The name felt like ash in my mouth. Excuse me. Her voice dropped to a dangerous, low vibrato. You will show me respect in this house, or so help me, I will have you removed. With what authority? I asked, tilting my head. The authority of a woman who lied to her husband for 30 years? Or the authority of a woman who's currently living in a house she doesn't legally own? Evelyn's face went a ghostly, translucent white. For a split second, the polished socialite vanished, and I saw the terrified girl underneath. But she recovered quickly, her mask of arrogance slamming back into place. You're delusional. The stress of being a paralegal has finally broken your brain. Leave. Now. Before I make sure you never work in this city again. Just then, Leo walked up, looking flushed and smug, flanked by two older men in expensive suits. Hey, Linda. Glad you could make it. Why aren't you carrying a tray? These guys need a refill. He laughed, and the two men joined in, assuming it was a quirky family joke. I looked at Leo, then at Evelyn, then at Robert, who was standing by the fireplace, looking at me with a mixture of guilt and annoyance. This was it. The breaking point wasn't a scream. It was a cold, hard snap of the soul. I realized I didn't want their love anymore. I wanted their absence. I didn't cause a scene at the dinner. I did something much worse. I left. I walked out of that house with a smile that felt like a serrated blade. I drove straight to a private courier service I had hired. Deliver them now, I said. While Evelyn was busy playing hostess and Leo was pitching his innovative startup to bored millionaires, 3 identical envelopes were being hand-delivered to the front door of the Howell estate. 1 for Robert, 1 for Evelyn, and 1 for the Howell family's lead estate attorney, who happened to be a guest at the party. I checked my phone. I had set up a private, password-protected cloud folder and sent the link to Robert's personal email address with the subject line, The Pity Project's Final Report. Inside that folder was the high-definition proof of their downfall. The DNA results showing my 49.8% match to Robert. The DNA results showing Leo's 0% match to Robert. A high-resolution scan of the post-nuptial agreement I'd taken from the safe, with clause 12.4 highlighted in neon yellow. The death certificate of Elena Vance and the hospital records proving my birth date preceded the Howell marriage. A detailed spreadsheet of every cent Leo had borrowed from the trust over the last 5 years, funds that, according to the trust's bylaws, were only to be used by biological descendants of the Howell line. I sat in a small, quiet diner 3 blocks away, ordering a cup of black coffee. I watched the clock. 8:15 p.m. My phone began to explode. First it was Leo. What is this? What the hell is this email? You think you can frame me? I'll kill you, Linda. Then it was Robert. No text, just 15 missed calls in the span of 10 minutes. Finally, the text I had been waiting for arrived from Evelyn. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. Linda, please. Come back to the house. We need to talk. Don't do this. I'll give you whatever you want. Please don't let Robert see the full file. It was too late. I had already BCC'd the estate attorney on the email. By the time Evelyn realized the ship was sinking, the hull had already been ripped wide open. I sat in that diner, the smell of cheap grease and old coffee grounds suddenly smelling like the sweetest perfume I had ever known. I pulled out a physical copy of the DNA results. I ran my finger over the name Elena Vance. Hi, Mom, I whispered to the empty air. I found you. And I'm taking everything back. The strategic twist wasn't just the DNA, it was the timing. By serving the papers during the investor dinner, I ensured there was a witness, the family attorney, who was legally obligated to act on the information regarding the trust's misappropriated funds. Evelyn hadn't just lost her pity daughter. She had lost her leverage, her fortune, and her son's future in one surgical strike. The leverage was absolute. Because Leo wasn't a Howell, every dollar spent on his startups was technically a breach of fiduciary duty by Robert and a fraud perpetrated by Evelyn. I wasn't just getting out of jail, I was taking the keys to the warden's office. The fallout was a symphony of architectural destruction. I didn't return to the house that night. Instead, I checked into a hotel and turned my phone to Do Not Disturb, except for my lawyer's number. By Monday morning, the Howell empire was a smoking crater. Because I had involved the estate attorney during a public event, he was legally bound to freeze the Howell trust accounts pending an investigation into lineage-based distribution fraud. I met Robert and Evelyn in a cold, sterile conference room at my lawyer's firm on Tuesday. The room smelled of floor wax and expensive leather. Evelyn looked like she had aged 20 years in 48 hours. Her hair, usually a perfect silver bob, was frizzy and unkempt. Robert looked hollow. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of his own cowardice had finally crushed his spine. "Linda," Robert started, his voice cracking. "We can settle this. You're my daughter. I always knew in my heart I knew you were Elena's. But you let her call me a pity project?" I said, leaning back in the ergonomic chair. My voice was a flat, dead line. "You let her scream that I was a burden while you sat there eating your rosemary chicken? You knew the truth, and you used it as a tool to keep your wife in line while letting her destroy my spirit. You're not a father, Robert. You're a silent partner in a 28-year-long abuse contract." Evelyn finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but still burning with a vestige of that old spite. "You've ruined us. Trust is frozen. The bank is calling in the loans on the house because the collateral was based on the Howell lineage. Leo is a wreck. He has nothing. Leo has exactly what I had for 28 years, I replied, sliding a folder across the table. He has the truth. And since he isn't a Howell, the trust is clawing back the $200,000 he borrowed. I believe the term for that is grand larceny if he can't pay it back. Which we all know he can't. Evelyn lunged across the table, her fingernails clawing at the mahogany. "You monster! I gave you a life. I kept you out of the foster system." "No," I said, slamming my hand on the table with a sound that made her jump. "You kept me as a human shield. You kept me so Robert would feel guilty enough to stay with you. You used me to hide the fact that your own son was another man's child. You didn't give me a life, Evelyn. You stole mine. And now I'm taking the interest." The settlement was brutal. Because of the post-nuptial agreement and the fraud regarding Leo's parentage, Evelyn was stripped of everything. Robert, in a desperate bid to avoid a public lawsuit and potential jail time for trust embezzlement, agreed to sign over my biological mother's rightful share of the estate, a sum totaling $3.5 million, plus the deed to the beach house in Oregon that Evelyn loved more than life itself. I watched as they signed the papers. Evelyn's hand was shaking so hard she could barely form the letters. When she finished, she looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "I hope you rot with that money," she spat. "I won't," I said, standing up and tucking my copy of the deed into my bag. "I'm going to use it to make sure no one ever treats me like a scrap of food again. Oh, and by the way, the locks on the beach house are being changed at noon. Your things will be on the curb." 6 months later, I am sitting on the deck of that Oregon beach house, watching the gray Pacific waves crash against the jagged rocks. The air is cold and salt-sprayed, but for the first time in my life, I can breathe. I am no longer a Howell. I legally changed my name to Linda Vance. I tracked down my mother Elena's family, a group of aunts and cousins in a small town in Montana who had been told I died at birth. When I showed up on their doorstep, they didn't ask for a DNA test. They just looked at my face, saw my mother's eyes, and pulled me into a hug that smelled like flour and rain. That was my first taste of a family that didn't come with a price tag. Robert tried to call me last month. He's living in a small 2-bedroom condo now, having lost most of his liquid assets to the trust's restructuring. He sounded old and lonely. He talked about starting over and forgiveness. I listened for exactly 60 seconds before I hung up. Forgiveness is for people who make mistakes. What he did was a calculated choice for 3 decades. He chose his comfort over my soul. Evelyn and Leo are living in a cramped apartment in the city. From what I've heard through the grapevine, Leo is working a retail job he hates, and Evelyn is constantly complaining to anyone who will listen about how she was betrayed by a child she raised as her own. She's still the martyr. She'll be the martyr until the day she dies, but now she's a martyr with no audience and no bank account. I realized that being adopted out of pity was the greatest lie I was ever told, but it was also the key that unlocked my cage. If she hadn't screamed those words at that Sunday roast, I might still be there, passing the gravy and shrinking into the shadows. Her attempt to break my spirit was the very thing that forged it into something unbreakable. I am Linda Vance. I am the daughter of Elena, a woman who loved a man she shouldn't have, but who gave me a face that finally told the truth. I am not a charity project. I am not a burden. I am a woman who built her own foundation on the ruins of a lie, and this time the walls are solid. I look out at the ocean, a glass of wine in my hand, the expensive kind, the kind I bought for myself. I take a sip, and the taste is perfectly, beautifully sweet. I am finally home,